Hello, everybody. Milkman Al here. Today we're going to be talking about my discharge. It's blue, green, red. It burns real bad. And no, we are not talking about my vagina. We're talking about my Elementalist. This is my Path of Exile 3.16 Scourge League Discharge Ignite Elementalist guide. I made this character, or one very similar to it, back in Ritual League, I believe, and it was one of my favorite characters that I'd ever played. It was super smooth to play, the damage was insane, and it was just a really fun playstyle all around, because you just get to nuke screens and delete monsters, and bosses, you basically just hit them once and run around and they die. So, I wanted to reprise that now that they've reworked the skill tree and kind of given damage over time a nice facelift. So, before we get into it, I would very much appreciate it if you like this video, you like my content, like and subscribe to the channel and the video, and it'll help me out. It'll help me climb through the YouTube algorithm ranks. Also, you can join me live on Twitch at MilkmanL1, twitch.tv/MilkmanL1 from 8 to 10 p.m. Central Time, Wednesdays and Sundays. So, I hope to see you there. In any event, like I said, this is one of my favorite characters, and so things have changed a lot since Ritual, and I wanted to give it a shot and see how this character was going to perform with the new skill tree, the new damage over time stuff, and it's really worked out pretty well for me so far. That said, the build is much different than it used to be, which may seem obvious, but what's maybe not as obvious is if you watched my video on cheap, easy league starters, the build actually played itself out much differently than what I anticipated it would do there, too. So, we'll go through all of that today. I'll have timestamps for skills, for equipment, for this skill tree, all of the different things listed in the description. I'll also paste this path of building in the description afterwards. So if you just want to cut to that, more power to you. But so, why don't we start with the basics? We'll start with skills. Here's my setup. I'll just list what I have, and then we'll talk about why exactly I have all of these different skills and why I've chosen what I've chosen, and how everything kind of works together. So first off is the obvious. There's Discharge, and just all of the highest damage links that it can have. One thing to note is that Cruelty doesn't really work very well with this build, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the skill tree, but basically the Cruelty buff doesn't apply to Ignites for some reason. I'm not sure if it's supposed to, if that's a bug, or if that's just how it works, but in any event, I originally had planned to use Cruelty, but didn't end up doing it. So then we've got some auras here, got Malevolence, Purity of Elements for Elemental Ailment Immunity, and Petrified Blood. And that's sort of a cornerstone of the survivability of this build, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Flame Dash for movement. You see the Swift Affliction and less duration. That's actually in the gloves that grant me Aspect of the Cat, which you see here, so that the rotating buff occurs more frequently. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. So I have a whole bunch of Corrupting Fevers on my weapon switch. They're just leveling those up to sell them, corrupt and sell them. No big deal there. Move along. Wave of Conviction is essentially my main debuff skill, so I use Wave of Conviction to apply fire exposure and also flammability and combustion. So with just casting this on bosses, which is pretty much all I use it for, occasionally some tough rares, they get a heaping resist penalty, which increases my damage a huge amount. So other auras. Clarity, this build suffers from mana problems a lot, but with Clarity, that goes away completely. It's also a very convenient thing to have on life reservation because it has a flat amount of reservation and ultimately does not end up preserving very much of your life at all. Defiance Banner for a little extra defense, and Vitality for life regeneration. Steel Skin for physical mitigation, because otherwise I have none. Other than sort of a paltry amount of armor here. And occasionally endurance charges, though I'm using those to blow stuff up more often than not. Okay, so those are the skills. Now, I mentioned that I would explain how all of these things work together. So first off, Purity of Elements, like I said, is elemental ailment immunity. Also a nice resist bonus, which kind of frees up some gear because this build is somewhat unique heavy. Malevolence, obviously damage bonus, which is nice. Petrified Blood is, as I said, the mainstay of survivability for this build. Now, why would I go low life, right? Low life is generally reserved for either spellcasters that do spell damage, which, in case you are unaware, ailments are not affected by spell damage. So going here to Pain Attunement does not give me or more ignite damage. So really all that it does is give me the straight up Petrified Blood benefit, and I end up using a Lori's Lantern to make all damage that hits me unlucky. And that, paired with the rather insane amount of life regeneration that an Elementalist can get, and Vitality, is actually quite enough to keep you pretty darn tanky, even into late game. So to get my life reservation, I've got Clarity, Defiance Banner, and Vitality all on Arrogance, and as you can see here, I reserve about 40% of my life. I'm considering ways to reserve a little bit more of my life and maybe squeeze in another banner or something, but I can't really figure out how to make that work, how to make the math work on that, because I really only have one socket free, and I would have to do some pretty interesting socketing gymnastics to fit something else in. So, like I said, the Wave of Conviction, this is actually a huge damage buff against single targets. An aspect of the cat is in combination with Feral's Fur, which we should go to talk about items now. So Feral's Fur is kind of what drives this build in the end game. As you see, it makes you gain up to your maximum number of frenzy and power charges whenever you gain Cat's Stealth. So like I said, aspect of the cat has a rotating buff. And like I showed you over here in skills, I have Swift Affliction and Less Duration in my gloves, which are what give me aspect of the cat, so that it rotates more quickly. And you get your frenzy and power charges more quickly. So the meat and potatoes of how this build works is Feral's Fur gives you your frenzy and power charges. Val's Devotion lets you gain a power charge, to gain an endurance charge every time you lose a power charge. And that's how you generate your endurance charges. And basically every time this cycles, you get all of your charges and can discharge stuff. And you have a huge amount of base damage to work with, and your ignites get pretty darn good, as you can see here. I have what I would probably call above average gear at this time, and I'm level 93, but none of this is particularly expensive. You can still definitely do this build on a budget. It is League Start friendly with a few exceptions, so you won't be using Discharge for a while. You need a Ramira's Banquet and Val's Devotion to really get your Discharge engine going. And Ramira's Banquet, in case you were unaware, generates power charges whenever you have a non-critical strike. So you will pretty easily be generating power and endurance charges at that point once you have those two items. But clearly that's not letting you reach your maximum damage potential since you're lacking frenzy charges. It's also a little bit clunky since you have to use an extra skill. I used Armageddon Brand in particular to generate your power charges in the first place to be able to discharge. So until that point, you can basically play this build as a generic Ignite character. I used Armageddon Brand, I used Fireball, I used Arc, and all of those were good. I liked Armageddon Brand the best. So if you're league starting with this character, that's probably what you're going to go for. It'll be late game before you can afford a Feral's Fur and actually get your charge generating engine in full gear. Searing Touch is a really, really good item for this build. It's basically best in slot, barring some ridiculous luck rolling a Warlord staff with tons of burning damage and maybe Awakening Orb smashing a +1 power charge Shaper Staff into it or something like that, which you can do. That's an in-game option, but the Searing Touch I got for 50 chaos. They're really cheap for, end-game gear. If you're looking to dump tons of exalts into this build, by all means, go for the crazy influenced items, but man, Searing Touch is just fine. I have a helmet that gives me life and power charges and a little bit of resist, or a power charge and a little resist. Feral's Fur, as we talked about. Got Frenzy Charge and life on my gloves, along with Aspect of the Cat, So here's a little trick that I actually didn't know about until this league. If you buy the Beastcraft for Aspect of the Cat, it makes your life way easier. I did not know that previously. So get a set of gloves with the Frenzy Charge on him. It'll probably cost you about an Exalt. And then just stick Aspect of the Cat on them. It's so much easier than finding a pre-made pair of gloves with everything that you need on it, including Aspect of the Cat. Got boots with an endurance charge. So that's how this goes, right? So helmet, you get power charge. Gloves, you get a frenzy charge. Boots, you get an endurance charge. You'll probably have to make a fair amount of sacrifices on other stats, as I have here, to get those things, because those are rare mods to roll. The gloves and helmet each cost me an exalt, and the boots I think cost me like 30 chaos or something. So none of this is very expensive. Feral's Fur was like 3 exalts at the time I bought it. Ring, just life resist ring, nothing fancy there. And Lori's Lantern, as I kind of mentioned earlier, the damage hitting you is unlucky while you're on low life is huge for survivability. It really helps you not get one shot. And it's also nice that Lori's Lantern is kind of a nice ring in its own right, just with extra movement speed, a fair amount of resists, and extra chaos res when you're on low life. So not a terrible thing to use for this slot, even though you do sacrifice some life to get it. And then belt is just life regen, armor, life, whatever. So you'll notice that a theme of all of these things is that I have a fair amount of life regeneration going on here. And that is because elementalists actually get a whole lot of life regeneration on the tree as well. So I'm taking advantage of Petrified Blood, essentially more or less doubling your life regeneration by making you function at half life. Whereas when you do that, your life regeneration numbers don't change. So when you're operating with 3,000 life, as I have, this life regen is functionally twice as good. With that, let's talk about the skill tree. So here's my tree at level 93. As I mentioned, you're not going to be able to get Discharge functioning for quite a while, especially if you league start with this build. So I was just kind of doing generic Ignite stuff for a long time. I didn't have any of the charges, but that doesn't really exclude much of the build, honestly. I just kind of didn't get this and continued on my merry way down here. So how I suggest you doing this is, I mean, pretty self-explanatory, right? You just do it in the order that you can. So you get all of these points, kind of meander around, and you wind up down here. This is actually, the Savagery node is the most recent thing that I spec'd into. So in my mind, there wasn't a whole lot of creative planning going on here. Now, the juicy part of this build comes in the masteries. So we've got a whole bunch of life masteries. Fire damage over time, fire exposure, all of that sort of stuff. Get some mana reservation efficiency. I have chosen to go with Shaper of Storms on my Ascendancy. I think that going for Shaper of Winter is a really good option if you're looking for more defense. So you can chill everything all the time, basically. You could also go for Heart of Destruction if you value that extra 30% damage, the rotating buff, but rotating buffs kind of bother me, so I chose not to do that, and get something more reliable instead with the shock. And I leaned into the shock a little bit, as much as I could, with the 20% there and the 40% there. So I've gone around, gotten all the charges. Another defensive layer for this build is Staff Block. So I came up here and got these block nodes. Also got this mastery that allows you to regenerate life and energy shield when you block. The rest of the stuff is pretty self-explanatory. Got Glancing Blow, so I block more frequently to take advantage of this and sort of smooth out the damage that I take. Also a one-shot prevention kind of thing. The regeneration here is really nice because you're always moving, basically, right? You just drop a discharge and run around while shit burns. So you're constantly regenerating that 2% life. Now, I think this mastery is underrated for Ignite builds. The 2% of life when you ignite a non-ignited enemy gives you a crap ton of regen, especially when you're mapping. or you're fighting bosses with lots of ads, this is a really, really good way to recover. In previous versions, Elementalists, especially damage over time Elementalists, Ignite Elementalist specifically, didn't have very many options for regenerating life and like recovery on the fly. And now that's actually a big strength of the build, which I thought was really cool, and why I chose to lean into that petrified blood, low life avenue. So going down here, I kind of get some armor nodes, a little regeneration, extra life. This cluster is freaking fantastic. The prismatic skin cluster here. You get a bunch of extra resistance and corrupted blood immunity. Holy shit, totally worth it. And then down here, I just flesh out the charges for extra base damage for ignites and some extra life and life regen. So this is by no means a definitive tree. I've considered doing things like, oh, I forgot to mention I anointed infused over here. So I've considered doing things like just eliminating this portion of the tree and getting this life and armor here to kind of, make yourself a little bit tankier and more resilient to physical attacks. That comes at the cost of some damage because you lose these charges, but it does give you quite a few points back, and the life is a little bit better. You lose these nodes here, but you gain those nodes in here, and it also gives you some options to spec into life regeneration or the life regen here, which is actually really, really nice. The extra 15% increased life regen, if you take this route and do the life regeneration as your recovery strategy, this hardy node is great. If you choose to do that, I suggest not anointing this, and here's why. So you want to balance your charges pretty carefully, specifically your power charges and your endurance charges. Any frenzy charges you get are just bonus. So with Vol's Devotion, like we talked about, you gain an endurance charge every time you lose a power charge. So if you have more maximum endurance charges than maximum power charges, you won't generate your maximum endurance charges very frequently. So you might be squandering some damage. Like your DPS in Path of Building will look really good, but your real damage probably will not be near that because you're not going to be utilizing that last endurance charge. So if you don't spec into this endurance charge, you don't need this extra power charge. Or, you can sacrifice that on your gear too. Just don't get the extra power charge from gear and save some cash on a helmet. Get some other fancy mods, -9 to nearby enemy fire resistance or something like that. What I recommend is anointing this instead, Searing Heat. That will compensate for a lot of your damage loss. And with the extra points that you save from not doing these, you will also be able to get a couple jewel slots, which will further compensate for damage. So you still probably lose about 10% damage over this strategy, maybe a little bit less, but you will have some extra armor and maybe a little bit extra life. So last things to consider when building your tree. Like I mentioned, I originally had planned to use Cruelty, but again, I'm not smart enough at this game to figure out whether Cruelty is bugged or just plain doesn't work, or is intended to not work with ignites. But initially I had spec'd into this mastery to get 30% increased effective Cruelty, which is a gigantic damage boost, but it doesn't work, so don't worry about that. Dexterity is a problem. You'll need to get it on gear or on the tree. Think of getting dexterity on the tree this way versus getting it on gear. You're spending a point to get 30 dexterity, right? Otherwise, you'd be spending a slot, a suffix on your gear to get X amount of dexterity, hopefully at least 30. So that suffix could be used, especially when you're in late game, to get 40 of a resistance, maybe 30 chaos resist, maybe some life regeneration, something like that. So would you spend a skill point on the tree to get 40 fire resistance, 30 chaos resistance? I sure as shit would. So if you can spare the points, even though this build is very point hungry, getting dexterity on the tree is probably your best bet. If you feel like you don't need something down here, then by all means, spec into these notables here. That will also help you with Bastion of Elements and give you a little more elemental protection, which is a small bonus, but, every little bit helps, especially when you're trying to min-max at the end of the game. So how does this build perform? I would say very well. I have done most in-game content at this point. I've killed the Shaper. I've killed a non-Uber Elder. The Guardians are not really a problem. I have not attempted Maven yet. I did an Act 4, or a Awakener 4 Cirrus. which I tanked his die beam twice. So this is actually a pretty tanky character. I don't recommend trying that, but you can do it. But yeah, definitely in-game viable. I cruise through tier 16 maps. Again, overall, the investment is probably certainly under 10 exalts for me at this point. Probably something like 7-ish. But you can definitely function well into in-game on much less. Like, really, the most expensive individual thing is Feral's Fur. So as long as you clear that 3 exalt hurdle, and you have the Val's Devotion and the Searing Touch, everything else is pretty much gravy. And Lori's Lantern, but that's like a chaos, so don't worry about that. But yeah, everything else is gravy. This is a great build. It's very easy to use, despite sort of functioning in a complex manner. Currently, I think life regeneration is massively underrated as a protective element, like a defensive layer. So take advantage of that by getting the cheap gear that's really, really good. So don't sleep on life regen, guys, especially if you're an Inquisitor, because Inquisitors are ridiculous this patch. I believe that's all I've got. I hope you enjoyed this build guide. I hope you enjoy the build, should you choose to build it. Again, definitely League Start viable with a little bit of modifications and patience. But in game, it's great. Silky smooth, 2 million DPS, which is much better than it sounds, because you're doing that damage consistently for probably about 5 or 6 seconds per cast of Discharge, and so you can run around a whole bunch and dodge mechanics. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and again, you can watch me live at 8 to 10 p.m. Central Time, Wednesdays and Sundays. I am Milkman Al. Happy discharging, folks, and happy holidays to you, by the way. Hope you have a great Thanksgiving, great Christmas. If you have any questions, drop me a comment. Thanks for watching.